Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm your host for today's talk show. No, just kidding. I'm moderating this second series of the viral virtual roundtable on Asian law series organized by the Center of Asian Legal Studies. And I want to thank you for attending. There will be no freebies like the Oprah Winfrey show, but you can probably expect a good discussion from our panelists today. So I'll begin by introducing the speakers. We have Professor Andrew Harding from NUS Law, Professor Cora Chan from HKU Faculty of Law, and Professor Arun Thiruvengadam from Azim Premji University. Now, and as your host, I'm also playing double duty here today. I will also be one of the speakers for today's session. We will start with Andrew Harding. Andrew, over to you.
Right, thank you very much, Dian, and welcome to everybody. Good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever it is you are. It's a particular pleasure to see my good friends Arun and Cora. And, thanks very much for the invitation to speak here, and thanks to everybody for organizing this. Now, I think my main task during this presentation is really just to kind of set the scene and draw some kind of theoretical parameters for the discussion. I'm not going to go into any discussion of individual countries and their responses, but rather to kind of set a framework in which we might think about central-local relations in this present situation with the pandemic. My first encounter with the pandemic was when I was a teenager doing cross-country running at school, and I remember that we had to clamber over farm gates and then splosh into a huge vat of disinfectant to avoid transmitting foot and mouth disease from one farm to another. Now, interestingly enough, that measure was put in place by the local authority, which was also the education authority. And so everybody knew that this measure was there. And I believe they even supplied the disinfectant. It was a pretty unpleasant experience to splosh into that, but you understood the reasons for it. And I think this is an interesting example because I doubt whether anybody in central government would have thought of a measure of this kind where there was danger from, you know, boys doing cross-country running, spreading foot and mouth disease from one farm to another, but the local authority thought of that. So, you know, one of my themes here is that local knowledge is very important when we think about this situation. So central-local relations and orientation with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the basic question I think we want to ask here is, how do central-local relations respond to a crisis such as a global pandemic? It seems pretty clear that responses across many countries have revealed a different range of responses, from excellent coordination in some cases to complete dysfunctionality in other cases, and also from extreme centralization in some cases to extreme decentralization in other instances. I think the low point reading about all this for me was reading about a group of city mayors in the United States who had spent the whole weekend sitting round in a virtual conference trying to work out what on earth it was the federal government was asking them to do. Time which could have been spent beneficially actually implementing what they were supposed to do rather than trying to work out what it actually was. So we have seen some pretty dire scenarios emerging from this in terms of central-local relations in some countries, but not all. Some countries have done extremely well, like Taiwan. Germany has been particularly good in central-local relations, and and many other countries. Singapore has been great in central-local relations because we don't have any local, we only have central. So it's been pretty easy thing to organize in Singapore. So what are the possibilities? The first, I think, is that the system might respond by completely collapsing central-local relations on at least on a temporary basis, but completely by giving plenary powers to the central government, irrespective of the operation or the desires of subnational units. And this is similar to what would happen, say, in wartime by an emergency proclamation or the like. And so some countries, not very many, have completely centralized the system during this period, and subnational units, local authorities, regional authorities, and so on, have simply done as instructed by the center. Alternatively, central local relations system may continue to operate in much the same way as it did previously. No real change despite the pandemic, operating under ordinary statute laws, for example, laws regarding the spreading of diseases, and the usual constitutional norms and processes governing central local relations. Indeed, some states have not even passed any new statutes to deal with this, at least not primary statutes, but have used the existing law and regulation through subsidiary or delegated legislation only in order to deal with the situation. And I think actually most countries have done something like that. Alternatively, possibly the central local relations system might be compelled to find new ways of coordinating responses to the pandemic. And some countries and some individual subnational units have managed to do this, but I think most countries have been struggling with this. And you can imagine when you're faced with a pandemic, there is a big question about, well, do the normal rules apply here, or is this an exceptional situation? And obviously, in some cases, there's been considerable confusion created by the fact that nobody really knows quite how central local relations are supposed to work in this situation. The confusion, as I mentioned, has been particularly apparent in the United States, with the president one day saying that he had absolute power to tell the state governors what to do, and then the next day saying that, of course, the state governors could do whatever they liked in response to the pandemic, sending rather strange mixed messages. So I thought it might be useful to just have a brief reminder of why we have centralized governance in the first place. This is a topic that unfortunately seems to be neglected in most constitutional law discussions. I'm actually myself working on decentralization in Southeast Asia at the moment for my research, and I'm hoping to learn a lot from the examples put forward by the other speakers in this seminar. So very simply and basically, we have decentralized governance for, I would say, 3 reasons. First is that local knowledge is always superior to central assumptions, as in my example of the foot and mouth disease. An example from the pandemic, the city authorities in Wuhan knew that they had a problem with this pandemic before Beijing did. And actually, initially, Beijing was resistant to describing this as a pandemic or doing anything in a concerted way to counter it, despite the fact that Wuhan was jumping up and down, sending messages and saying this is a really serious situation. So even just in identifying the problem, local knowledge can be extremely important. Secondly, local decision making can garner resources better and can experiment locally with certain policy responses. Kerala, for example, I don't know if Arun is going to talk about this, has responded in ways that have been highly effective, and obviously set other subnational units, other states thinking about whether they could do the same thing. With regard to local decision making and more resources being available, it was very interesting to see how one governor of a US state was absolutely frustrated by the failure of the federal government to supply PPEs in his state, giving up on the federal government. It so happened his wife was Korean, and his wife contacted people in Korea, and within a couple of days they had 500,000 PPEs on the doorstep. So you know, local knowledge can be very important for local decision making, and again, I don't think that would have happened if the central government had been involved, and here the local knowledge was right within the governor's own household. So I thought that was an interesting example. Thirdly, local autonomy can legitimately diverge from central demands due to differing perceptions or different priorities that they may have. They know their situation and they know how they wish to respond to their situation better than central government would do. So, for example, urban and rural areas often have very different problems and different political preferences, and problems when it comes to issues like opening up schools and adopting SOPs, for example, for particular economic sectors. So if you look at the four nations of the United Kingdom, for example, when the government issued its advice about opening up but staying alert, as they put it, I found that very puzzling. Stay alert for what exactly? The other nations, the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish, were very puzzled. I said, what on earth is this advice? Sorry, I think we'll just reject that and formulate our own advice as to what to do. So all of these are reasons why decentralized governance is important in normal times, but is, I would suggest, particularly important in these times. So what exactly then are the purposes of central-local relations in a situation like this? Central-local relations are designed to provide for smooth operation of policies and measures via what people sometimes call cooperative federalism and the like, to ensure policy coordination. One example that emerged recently is that in a number of countries, there's been a problem in trying to work out how to properly fund local authorities when they're being required to take exceptional measures that they wouldn't take under normal circumstances, creating extra expenses, and local budgets are always under the cosh from the central government. So how do you deal with that problem? That obviously has to be a matter of coordination between the centre and the devolved decentralized units. Secondly, central-local relations resolve conflicts between the centre and the subnational unit, and here there may well be a range of political, administrative, and possibly legal or even judicial methods for resolving those conflicts. And if you want to know more about that, if I might just advertise briefly, Mark Seidel and I did an edited book on this subject in 2015, Central Local Relations in Asian Constitutional Systems. Incidentally, that book also contains a very interesting chapter by Professor Shiga Matsui talking about the Fukushima disaster in Japan and pointing out the rather dysfunctional responses resulting from a defective system of central-local relations in Japan arising out of that particular incident. It looks as though things have improved considerably since the Fukushima incident, because Japan is one of the countries that has coordinated extremely well in the response to the pandemic. Thirdly, central-local relations may provide for remedial action by the centre in the case of some kind of breakdown. whether it's due to financial issues or legal issues or whatever is the problem. Usually there are some kind of reserve powers vested in the central government to take over the local unit, to dismiss the officials, to recall the officials, and there's a variety of remedies that can be used. Interestingly enough, this measure has been, I would say, markedly absent. In fact, I can't think of a single instance that has happened during the pandemic of things getting so bad that the central government simply had to sort of remove the local authority and take over the running of the locality themselves. That obviously is an extreme measure, but it's proved not to have been really necessary.
If I may interject, I'm usually not authoritarian, but you have 2 minutes, sorry.
Yes, that's just about right, Dian. I think I'll be within that. Thanks for the reminder. Okay, so what is my argument about this? My argument is that the pandemic does not contradict the basic rationale for decentralized governance. Subnational units have in fact used local knowledge to identify threats, to highlight problems, make urgent demands, and also to find creative ways of regulating or improving resource provision. Often this local knowledge has received inadequate responses from an obtuse or uninformed or inefficient central administration. When it comes to issues of opening up and economic recovery, subnational units are very differently placed, and some variation in policy is, I think, perfectly justified in this situation. So my conclusion is this: those states that have been most successful have had good coordination, but have not tried to dictate to subnational units. The subnational units have generally performed actually more impressively than central governments have, because they have been confusing in policy and messaging, dilatory in provision, and ineffective in coordination. In fact, we can see that in many instances, the subnational units have coordinated amongst themselves better than the central government has been involved in it. So my conclusion is that broadly, states can and should stay within the constitutional norms with regard to decentralized government, but they need to evolve close, effective, and possibly even new forms of coordination to deal with situations like pandemic. So pandemic does not, in my view, mandate anything like the collapsing of central-local relations into purely central power. Rather, it mandates their enhancement. And that's where I'm going to stop. And I think it's within the 2 minutes, Dian, so thank you very much. And there's just a slide, so you can see, a photo from 1920, the Spanish flu with the theatres being closed by order of the local mayor, emphasizing the local decision making. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for providing us with a great theoretical grounding for our discussion going forward. So I now hand over the screen to Cora from Hong Kong.
Thank you very much, Dian, and thank you, Jacqueline, for inviting me to this roundtable, and also special thanks to Andrew for the very helpful theoretical framework. I'm going to first talk about how central-local relations play out in the responses to COVID, focusing on the China-Hong Kong context, as well as central-local relations in mainland China. After that, I will talk briefly about how the pandemic has been exploited by Beijing to erode Hong Kong's autonomy. So by way of background, for those who are not familiar with the China-Hong Kong context, China is a unitary state, but Hong Kong, along with Macau, are special administrative regions that enjoy a high degree of autonomy and practice economic and legal systems that are different and separate from mainland China's socialist arrangements. And this arrangement has been known, this central local arrangement has been known as one country, two systems. So central local relations in China are asymmetric. The degree of autonomy that Hong Kong and Macau have is much greater than that of subunits in mainland China. The first subject that I'm going to address, how does central-local relationship play out in the responses to COVID? To draw on the framework that Andrew presented, I would say that the China-Hong Kong relationship falls largely within the business as usual model. So basically the second model that Andrew presented. And subject to what I will say later on, that's a very important caveat, subject to what I'm going to say, the relationship between China and Hong Kong has by and large operated in accordance with ordinary constitutional rules. Under Hong Kong's mini constitution, the basic law, public health is a matter that falls within Hong Kong's autonomy. And so far, Hong Kong has had close to full autonomy in dealing with the pandemic. For example, deciding whether to use local emergency laws and how to use them. And Beijing's involvement in Hong Kong's handling of the pandemic has been limited. Its instances of involvement can be categorized into two types, again, which drawing from Andrew's framework. The first type is when a subject matter falls under the central government's purview is involved. So according to the basic law, a subject matter that falls under Beijing's purview is involved, hence triggering Beijing's intervention in accordance with constitutional norms. These subject matters are raised more often than usual because of the transnational and cross-border nature of the issues raised by a pandemic. For example, under the basic law, foreign affairs are under the purview of the central government. So during the pandemic, Hong Kong has had to enlist the help of the Central Foreign Affairs Ministry to charter flights to bring back Hong Kong residents stranded in foreign countries. That's one example. Another example is under the basic law, the issuing of permits for mainland Chinese people to visit Hong Kong is also a function vested with mainland authorities. And again, during the pandemic, the Hong Kong chief executive noted that it was, quote unquote, with the approval of the central government that the mainland would stop issuing visiting permits to Hong Kong. And all of these are done within the existing constitutional framework. The second type of cases in which Beijing has been involved in Hong Kong's responses to COVID are where the pandemic has called for the third type of model, what Andrew calls new forms of central-local coordination. Coordination which is not normally needed and the regulation of which is not stipulated in existing procedures, but is nevertheless needed in times of pandemic to prevent practical problems. For example, if the Hong Kong government intends to stop some transportation between mainland China and Hong Kong, well, I think it's best that they first inform its mainland counterparts. Imagine the chaos that would be caused if people in the mainland didn't know about this and they were all stuck in mainland train stations or airports, or the recognition of health certifications of key workers that have had to cross borders. Many of these instances of coordination are uncontroversial, but at least one occasion was controversial. It was rather confusing because it wasn't clear in that occasion whether the central or local authorities have legal powers of taking a particular decision. And the coordination process raises queries on whether the central government usurped powers that belong to the local government. We simply don't know if that is the case because we don't know how the power sharing ought to be in the first place. And the occasion I have in mind is that of the Hong Kong government refusing to close all its borders with mainland China. It's not clear from the basic law whether complete closure of borders with China is a decision that can be legally taken by the local government unilaterally. Prima facie, nothing in the basic law prevents the Hong Kong government from taking this step, but one may argue that closure of borders with China concerns the relationship between China and Hong Kong and is hence not exclusively within Hong Kong's purview. Let's assume for the purpose of discussion that it is within Hong Kong's power to close borders with close borders with China. Let's assume that that is the case, that it is within Hong Kong's powers to close borders with China, a position that hasn't really been rejected by the Hong Kong government so far. what happened was that during the early stages of the pandemic, despite vehement calls from the Hong Kong public for the Hong Kong government to shut all its borders with mainland China in order to stop the virus from coming into Hong Kong. And there was even a strike by the medical profession calling for the shutting of borders, so you can imagine how serious the matter was. Despite all of this, the Hong Kong chief executive refused to shut all borders. And there were speculations at that time that she refused to do so because the central government didn't allow her to. Although we have no way of verifying these speculations. We simply don't know if the decision not to close borders was a decision that the chief executive took on her own, or did Beijing compel her to take that decision, thereby usurping powers that properly belong to the Hong Kong government. But this saga over border closure illustrates two broader points surrounding central-local relations. The first is that the interest of a subnational unit may not align with that of the national unit. The national unit inevitably has in mind the interests of the nation as a whole. So measures that it prefers may not be in the best interest of particular subunits, especially subunits that are doing better than the rest of the nation. For example, in the pandemic context, we can imagine that the central government may wish to allocate medical resources of a less affected region to other regions, something that the less affected region may not prefer. Tensions between a subunit and the national unit or amongst subunits have been widely observed in the pandemic, but they're actually a specific manifestation of the inevitable contestation between subunits and the national unit, as well as amongst subunits in any sovereign state. Consider, for example, the well-off Catalonian region wanting to secede from Spain, or indeed any sovereign or supranational unit. Consider, for example, the imperatives behind Brexit. The second issue raised by the case of border closure is how much decentralization should there be for dealing with the pandemic depends on at least two factors. First, what is the normative criteria for determining the degree of decentralization? For example, is the criteria, are we seeking to maximize the welfare of one subnational unit or of the nation as a whole? And what aspects of welfare are we seeking to enhance? For example, are we seeking to enhance just the health of people, or do we include long-term economic recovery as well? And the latter may well hinge on the recovery of the nation as a whole, decisions of which might be better made by the central government. The second factor that affects whether there should be more decentralization is, of course, the relative abilities of the national and subnational government. For example, if decentralization may not be desirable, and it may be desirable for the national government to take over a local region entirely, as Andrew has pointed out, where local governments are less competent than the central government. This leads me to the subject of central-local relations within mainland China. Like China and Hong Kong, the relationship between China and Hong Kong, central-local relations in mainland China during COVID has also been business as usual. China's usual model for dealing with issues that affect the security of the leadership has been followed. That is a highly centralized approach and a strong leadership from above, with the Chinese Communist Party leading and coordinating efforts once the party became alerted to the seriousness of the issue. There wasn't a complete collapse of central-local relations, just that in accordance with the usual approach in dealing with nationwide threats, the center, the party leadership from above takes the initiative and coordinates efforts. Whether this highly centralized approach has been successful in dealing with the pandemic is hard to assess, because, as Eva Pils and other people have argued, we've no way of verifying the numbers of infections and deaths in mainland China. But even assuming that the approach taken has been successful, I think what China's story tells us is that it could have coped even better if there was freedom of expression and a political system in which those that govern are accountable to the public rather than solely to their superiors. These conditions are certainly prerequisites for a devolved model to work. For example, without these conditions, more devolution might only lead to more incompetent and corrupt local governance. But these conditions are also necessary for realizing the full potential of a centralized approach. And for a good example of a very effective centralized approach, Taiwan would be an example. The thing is, no matter how capable and how well-intentioned the party's leadership might be, in order to respond in time and appropriately, it needs accurate information about the pandemic on the ground. With tight censorship, the central government is likely to miss crucial information, such as the early alerts by Dr. Liu Liang, the whistleblower whom the authorities initially silenced. And of course, party leaders could rely on local officials or party leaders to report information. But the current system of accountability in mainland China is designed such that local officials only account to their superiors and not to the people. And the mentality of maintaining stability runs really deep. So local officials could be sanctioned simply because there was instability in their regions without thorough investigation into responsibility. So under this accountability framework, local officials have every incentive to hide bad news in their region. Even if they had superior information, they might hide it, even at grave cost to the interests of the people they govern. So without proper accountability to the public, it would be risky to give local officials too much power, as Zhang Qianfan has argued in Andrew and Mark's edited collection. So centralization won't probably be a better approach is probably the better approach than devolution in dealing with the pandemic before reforms to the accountability system at the local level are introduced. The irony then is that without democracy at the local level, the full potential of a centralized approach cannot be realized. But if the Chinese leadership was willing to grant democracy at local levels, it probably no longer needs such a highly centralized approach. And finally, I'm going to spend, I know that time is running out for me, I'm going to spend 2 minutes, just very briefly, to cover how the pandemic has been exploited by the Chinese government to curb Hong Kong's autonomy. Just as the world's attention was diverted by COVID and Hong Kong people are banned from protesting in the name of protecting public health, Beijing decided to impose a national security law in Hong Kong. And I'd like to propose a typology of how a catastrophe like a pandemic could be exploited by states to flout constitutional norms. A typology would probably look something like this. On one side of the axis, we have two ways in which the state could exploit catastrophes. The first way would be to exploit it directly through the abuse of emergency powers the state wields during a pandemic. The second way of abuse would be indirect abuse through exploiting the void of local and international monitoring against rights abuses in times of a global pandemic. For example, people can't come out to protest, international media's attention is all on COVID, etc. On the other axis lies the types of constitutional norms that the state seeks to violate. And there could be any number of types, at least two types, fundamental rights and freedoms, and also norms pertaining to the sharing of power between central and local authorities. And possibly there could be a third dimension to the typology as well, the nature of encroachment of rights and autonomy. The encroachment could be one-off or temporary, or on the other hand, the encroachment of autonomy and rights could be in the form of introducing enduring and systemic changes to the central-local relationship or the system for protecting rights. Examples, we can see numerous instances of states exploiting COVID to curb freedoms. Think India, think Hungary. We also see instances of states exploiting COVID to temporarily strip local governments of their power. Think Brazil. But on the other hand, there have been far fewer examples of central governments exploiting COVID to strip local autonomy permanently and systemically. And the case of Hong Kong is one of such few instances. So very briefly, just 30 seconds, the way in which Beijing imposed the national security law apparently violated the Hong Kong Basic Law, which stated clearly that it is for the local legislature to enact laws on its own on certain national security crimes. And because the law will be enacted by the national rather than the local legislature, the final power of interpreting the law is also likely to be vested with Beijing rather than Hong Kong. So the move likely curbs Hong Kong's judicial autonomy as well. But most importantly, because of Beijing's broad conceptions of security, the imposition of the national security law has drastically increased the potential occasions whereby the central government could interfere with the freedoms that distinguish Hong Kong from China. So Beijing's move brings central-local relations in the Hong Kong context one step closer to, well, to borrow Andrew's words, one step closer to a collapse into purely central power.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cora, for your explanation and analysis. I think we see some trends of that in countries like Indonesia as well, which I will turn to, where COVID, the pandemic, has been used as an excuse almost to suppress fundamental rights and freedoms in the Constitution. Now, building on Andrew's theoretical framework, I want to suggest two main ways of understanding the development of central-local relations in certain countries in Southeast Asia. The first is coordination, which suggests a degree of cooperation and complementarity between central and state or subnational governments. In the context of central-local relations and decentralization, one might see this as the best case scenario. The second point I want to suggest is defiance or control. Now, this for me indicates a degree of dysfunctionality in central-local relations. And this is where central government exerts more top-down control, or in some cases, they could also display a more lackadaisical attitude in managing the pandemic. Now, either way, subnational or local governments might toe the line or defy the central government and take charge. Now, these are broad synthesis of the patterns that have emerged in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia. And in my brief presentation today, I shall focus on these two countries. Now, Indonesia's experience presents an interesting study for central-local relations, because here you have a central government that was, especially in the beginning, in denial over the spread of the virus in the country. So while other countries in Southeast Asia reported increasing number of cases daily, in Indonesia, it was only on March 2nd that the government confirmed the first case in the country. So just over a month later, Indonesia witnessed the number of cases which had risen to over 2,000 cases. Now, just a couple of weeks before the first case emerged, the health minister was quoted as saying that Indonesia's COVID-free position was attributable to prayers. Another minister then claimed that the virus could not survive Indonesia's warm and humid conditions. And these were seen as indications that the government was playing down the threat of the virus and the spread of the virus. In fact, the president later admitted that the government had withheld information from the public, ostensibly to avoid widespread panic. Of course, later the central government reacted. While countries in the region have implemented more stringent restrictions, including variations of lockdowns, curfew, movement control orders, and so on, Indonesia has opted for what is called PSBB, which is an acronym for large-scale social restrictions. And this was announced by the president in late March. The idea of declaring a civil emergency was initially mooted by the government, but the central government did not follow up on that. Of course, if they had done so, then the central government would wield tremendous power and control over the management of the pandemic. But under the PSBB, there are restrictions on social and religious gatherings, physical distancing measures, closure of schools and some workplaces, but there was no clear prohibition on inter-district travel or public recreational activities. Now, in announcing the government regulation and presidential decree on the PSBB, President Jokowi emphasized that local governments must act according to the central government's plans and visions, and that any measures at local level must be discussed with the central government. But despite that, local governments have actually been crucial in implementing PSBB policies. Governors, for instance, are in charge in determining the length of PSBB status for a particular province. Jakarta, for instance, has extended PSBB indefinitely, although the governor has also announced that regulations will be modified to transition to a new normal. In some cases, again, Jakarta is an instructive example. The PSBB rules and measures were more stringent than those issued by the central government through the Ministry of Health. But it remains the case that the central government is responsible for approving the designation of PSBB status for the provinces. And only then, once they obtain that status, only then can the governor implement PSBB rules for the particular province. We also see other roles of local government that were outside of the scope of PSBB. For instance, in the case of the city of Tasikmalaya in West Java and the province of Papua, they have implemented local quarantine policies. In the case of Jakarta, even before the central government announced a public health emergency and announced the PSBB in late March, the Jakarta governor had already declared a COVID emergency for Jakarta, which resulted in the closure of tourist attractions, offices, entertainment venues, and so on. And this was enforced by the Jakarta Police and Military Command. Also, the governor of Jakarta has constantly engaged in a tug of war with the central government and the president on a variety of issues such as who should decide upon and enforce physical distancing measures. Anies Baswedan, the governor, was of course more in favor of stricter, tougher measures to contain this pandemic. Turning to Malaysia, different circumstances played out here because the country was forced into a political crisis just as the cases began to rise. In a country where the federal government wields significant power in managing national crisis and policy making, this political drama in February and March left Malaysia without a captain of the ship, so to speak, for a week and a half. In terms of the overall framework for a public health crisis management, as in Indonesia, the central government is, or the federal government in Malaysia's case, is the locus of power. In fact, one sees patterns of a more top-down approach led by the National Security Council chaired by the Prime Minister. Malaysia, of course, took early organized steps to respond to the pandemic, supported by competent civil service officers from various ministries, especially from the Health Ministry. The government introduced measures short of a complete lockdown, but the strict movement control orders spanned 6.5 weeks from 18th of March. And during this period, all schools, industries, and offices were shut. Domestic and international travel bans were imposed. There were restrictions on operating hours of restaurants, supermarkets, and so on. As far as center-local relations are concerned, this top-down approach meant that there was limited consultation with state governments. And in fact, at one point, chief ministers of states controlled by the opposition party were completely excluded from discussion of the measures to be imposed. And there are, of course, issues of efficiency when top-down approaches were instituted. So for instance, interstate travel was restricted at one point, and people would need to apply for police permission to travel between states. And this, again, at one point led to overcrowding in police stations because they simply could not cope with applications, paper applications for travel. And this requirement was later revoked. State and local governments have, of course, taken charge in matters such as regulating the operating hours of supermarkets and restaurants. And under the law, they do have the authority to do so, especially in the context of preventing the spread of diseases and regulating public health. So when the federal government announced relaxing of restrictions under the movement control order to allow businesses and economic activity to resume, some states actually defied that policy. They responded instead that they would continue operating under present rules. And one of the justifications was that they needed time to implement new standard operating procedures to facilitate the relaxation of the movement control order, taking into account public health concerns and so on. So that's the situation in these two countries, Malaysia and Indonesia. But just to place that in the broader constitutional and legal context of both countries, Malaysia is a very centralized federal system. Some scholars have even characterized Malaysia as the most centralized federation in the world. States have very limited legislative powers, but matters involving public health are under the federal list matters involving health are under the federal list of legislative power, but public health matters are in the concurrent list. In any case, if there are consistencies between federal law and state law, federal law prevails. Now, by contrast, Indonesia is a unitary state with arrangements for devolution of power, but the central government retains exclusive authority only in 6 areas, including foreign relations, security, defense, and fiscal policies. But there are areas that fall within the concurrent jurisdictions of both central and provincial governments, and that includes health, public order, and education. Now, in both countries, as I said, the measures to implement restrictions were made pursuant to laws such as the Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases Act in Malaysia, presidential decrees and government regulations in the case of Indonesia, which were enacted pursuant to the 2018 health quarantine law. So what do these responses indicate in terms of the broader issue of decentralized governance? There are several issues to consider here based on the brief details that I've provided earlier. Now, it is clear that while central or federal governments are in charge or have taken charge to some extent, local or state governments have also been proactive in some respects. In addition to the example that I mentioned previously, some states in Malaysia, such as the East Malaysian states of Sabah and Sarawak, have implemented their own policies on entry into their borders. For instance, requiring PCR tests to be done upon arrival. The state of Selangor, which I'm in, instituted its own modification of the federal government's conditional movement control order. It developed apps for contact tracing, and it expanded PCR tests for free for senior citizens and symptomatic individuals. The consequence of all this, of course, is that we see emerging tensions between central and local governments. Now, often legal frameworks are open to competing interpretation on whether state or federal policies would prevail on matters regarding public health. And in the case of Malaysia, when the federal government faced pushbacks from certain state governments about reopening the economic activity, the federal government actually reacted by saying that companies could sue state governments if they refuse to resume economic activity. So confusion and competition did not only affect countries like the US, as Andrew has mentioned earlier, but also we see a great degree or many examples of that in Malaysia and Indonesia. Now, having said that, decentralized governance or action could take some of the weight off of the central government in managing the pandemic. Andrew's point about local knowledge and local decision making, I think, is very important. The increased efficiency, mobilization of healthcare workers and the security apparatus. And I think that decentralized governance could allow targeted responses that reflect local needs, as has happened in certain states in Malaysia and Indonesia in the case of Jakarta. We can discuss further the lessons to be learned from the experiences of various countries. This include, as I mentioned earlier, the need for clear legal frameworks governing central-local relations. Failing that, at least better coordination between central and local governments to prevent confusion, conflicting information, or tensions between them. But finally, I would also like to point out that what has been evident in both countries, Malaysia and Indonesia, is the politics of central-local relations or the broader political considerations. I think Cora alluded to this at the very end of her presentation as well. So for instance, in Indonesia, President Jokowi has initially warned of the dangers of this mass exodus, or what is called in local language mudik, basically means people going back to their hometowns for festive celebrations. So he has warned about the dangers of this, about travel, but he seemed reluctant to take tougher measures to prevent this mass exodus and inter-province or inter-district travel. And the reason for that, according to some commentators, is that he's actually afraid of criticisms or worried about criticisms from his political opponents. In Indonesia, we see the handling of the COVID-19 management has been securitized or even militarized, as some might call it, because the Indonesian military or TNI officers appear to be at the forefront of both national and local management efforts. The TNI organization, the military as a whole, has not been fully mobilized to take over civilian policy decision-making, but you see that in the cabinet level, for instance, President Jokowi employs several retired generals as his minister. The National Coronavirus Disease Response Task Force is headed by a former commander of the Army's Special Forces who employs active duty officers in addition to medical and public health experts and so on. And in Malaysia, as we've seen, I've mentioned this earlier, there are deep divisions between coalitions ruling at the federal level and the state level, and this was magnified by the political crisis in February and March, which, as we have seen, has hampered coordination and cooperation in managing a public health crisis. So I'll stop there. We'll of course discuss this in the Q&A session, but now over to Arun, who will provide some insights from South Asia.
Let me begin by thanking you, Jacqueline, Andrew, and others at CALS who organized this very interesting virtual roundtable. I'm really very happy to be here also because, as Andrew mentioned, this is a great opportunity to learn from colleagues. I attended the first roundtable and also was benefited tremendously from the insights that are offered. So just by way of introduction, I realize we're slightly perhaps behind time, and I am really looking forward to the discussion. So I'll keep my remarks, I'll try and keep my remarks brief. It's always a challenge, especially in this format. But I wanted to start by saying, as Dian said, my remit is to really look at South Asia, and as we know, that's going to be difficult in 15 minutes. But I just want to say, just looking at the broad theme and what has happened so far and how my presentation fits into that, I think Andrew set us up very well with this initial presentation, which gives us the broad arguments from constitutional and legal theory about center-local relations. And I think Andrew's been very careful in his terminology. We have referred to federalism, but central local is a good way to also look at how these things play out in unitary states. I also wanted to say a little bit about the title, Coming Together or Coming Apart. I recognize this as a nod to the work of the brilliant political scientist Alfred Stepan, who talked about federations, and he's talked about different models of that. And in one of his early works, 1999 article, he talks about the United States being an example of a coming together federation. And he talks about India, for instance, he calls it a holding together federation, right? So this points to the important historical difference of how federalism or central state relations are framed in different parts of the world. And I want to suggest, and it's just sticking with that slightly broader point of history first. So I'll make a historical point. I'll then turn to legal responses across South Asia and focusing particularly on India in the interest of time. And I want to just add to the mix of issues that others have mentioned. One important aspect that we are watching in India is the issue of fiscal federalism, right? So how are monies allocated between different levels of government? How much access do they have to resources, either through taxation or other ways? I mean, to fight a pandemic, you really need, as we are seeing everywhere, a vast range of resources in the health sector to procure PPEs, ventilators, and what are constitutional arrangements for that. I think as we've talked about it, fiscal federalism has been underlying some of the issues, but I just want to highlight that as one issue to think about. And then finally, I'll sort of probably dwell on what Andrew's already mentioned, the Kerala model, which I think exemplifies an important principle of federalism, or the subsidiarity principle. Right? This is what the Europeans call the subsidiarity principle, or the fact that, as Andrew mentioned, things should be handled at the lowest level possible for purposes of efficiency. There's a tension between when do you need centralization and when do you need local knowledge or subsidiarity. Right? So that's very broadly what I'll try and talk about. So let me say a little bit about the historical point. So if you look at South Asia, it's one of the most heavily populated and densely populated regions of the world. South Asia, the 9 or 10 countries of South Asia account for nearly 2 billion people. And I'll mention this in terms of abuses of power that others have talked about. 31% or so of the world's Muslims live in South Asia, right? And particularly in India, the 200 million odd Muslim population has been under attack in some ways, existentially, for some time. And under COVID-19, we've seen that continue. And that's the point that I.Cora made, that tendencies that you saw before COVID-19 have continued to play out in COVID-19. So the broad historical point I just want to mention, and I think many of us have talked about systems which have been impacted by what has happened over the last 2 or 3 centuries. And I think the biggest force there is colonialism, right? And I think what one sees, this idea of colonial continuities, is something that you continue to see in South Asia, 7 decades after decolonization. And I think it's important to recognize not just colonialism, but also pre-colonial orders. So historians who take a longer view of the South Asian nations will point out that in the pre-colonial era, you had many types of differentiated and layered sovereignty. It's really with the advent of colonialism that you saw centralization in a very strong form, right? And what has happened in the post-colonial era is many of the nationalist leaders in South Asian societies decided to continue with centralized policies, very often to meet perhaps legitimate concerns. So in the aftermath of decolonization, many of these nations faced huge developmental challenges, which continue today. South Asia remains one of the poorest regions in the world, and we are beginning to see that in the type of responses when you look at the severe pressure on health systems, right? So that's been one of the phenomena that people have commented on, this that in the pre-colonial era, there was an emphasis on layered sovereignty, on allowing local or regional authorities to have power, political power, administrative power, and fiscal power. During colonialization, during colonialism, which was largely, I think that colonialism had many facets to it, but one understands that if it's an extractive enterprise, then centralization works very well. And for a large part, colonialism saw advent of centralized regimes, which as you headed towards the period of decolonization in around 1950, that's the broad period for South Asia, you saw that there were attempts at bringing in federal elements and also decentralization processes. So that's something to think about. Let me now focus, I'll just say a little bit. If you look at South Asian constitutions as a whole, they've grappled with unitary models which are trying to cede power away to local and federal units. Pakistan, which has had 3 formal constitutions in its post-independence era, there have been recent changes in 2010 quite prominently, where there were attempts made to give powers to state and regional authorities. If you take Nepal as an example of a state which in 2015 came up with a constitution which tries to promote federalism and decentralization. So there's been this toggling between these wanting to move towards a unitary state for purposes of maintaining cohesion, and then recognizing, as Andrew said, that for purposes of delivery of welfare services, you probably need decentralized modes which are more effective and can reach people at the local level. And that tension continues to exist. Looking at India very quickly, India has what Stepan and his co-authors in a recent book called a state-nation model. Although the formal constitutional model of India leans very heavily towards the center. So this is very much a holding together model in Alfred Stepan's conception. It tried to allow for asymmetric forms of federalism. Kashmir was a prominent example. The states in the Indian Northeast have been given a considerable amount of autonomy to deal with their sort of local issues. So the formal constitution was very much a pro-center model, but as India's political system changed in the 70 years of independence, you began to see that there was a move towards giving the different regions greater power. And between 1989 and 2014, when we had coalition governments at the center, which were heavily dependent on regional parties, you saw many forms of innovative federalism. But since 2014, when the Modi government took power, and it's the first time in a quarter century that a government at the center had the numbers in the lower house of parliament to be able to assert itself, you begin to see what we saw in the first 2 or 3 decades after independence, greater centralization. So I will come to COVID-19 specifically, but I want to draw attention to these broader historical patterns to say what we are seeing in the pandemic is in many societies, fault lines and persistent problems are rearing their heads. And you see that similar pattern. So if you just look at between 2019, May, when Narendra Modi got re-elected, you saw a series of issues where these questions of federalism came up, right? So in August 2019, in a single stroke, Kashmir lost its status as an independent, as a state, and was converted into a union territory. This was done overnight. Its legality is still in doubt, but that question persists even as we look at how Jammu and Kashmir is being handled in the time of COVID-19. And there were similar attempts at other federal policies which are impacting the response to COVID-19 because of these centralizing measures which have been there earlier. So very quickly on COVID-19 and the legal response to it in India. Formally, the Constitution allows for the invocation of an emergency or the declaration of an emergency. Across Asia, we've seen very little use of that. And partly, at least in India, there's a question of whether something like a pandemic could fall into the language that would justify a formal declaration of emergency. But the practical reason has been that when you declare an emergency, there are all kinds of constitutional checks which fall into place. And I think governments around the world have largely avoided. There have been some instances of formal invocations of emergency, but that has not happened in India. That would be, to go back to Andrew's presentation, that would be a legitimate way to invoke the centralizing response to an emergency. What has happened in India is the second model that Andrew talked about, where there's a use of existing laws. There's some question about whether those existing laws really apply to a pandemic. We have an Epidemics Act of 1897. Again, that's the importance of the colonial context. That same colonial law is being invoked. And then we have a more recent 2005 Disaster Management Act, which has been invoked by the central government to bring in place the lockdowns that we've had since March 24th. And again, there's some question about whether the pandemic is really a disaster as envisaged by the 2005 Act, which really conceives of a situation where one particular region or area has been affected by a disaster. Nevertheless, that hasn't, I think, been formally challenged, but the Disaster Management Act has been invoked by the central government in the first instance on March 24th to impose the first phase of the lockdown. And at that time, it also was a very centralizing impulse. As we've gone through the various other lockdowns that have come, and we are in version 5.0 of the lockdown, where the center has realized that it's trying to centralize the response has not worked very well, and has allowed states greater autonomy in being able to deal with that. Right. The one point I would say, as the states now are dealing with it, and South Asia is right now very much in the grip of COVID-19. India has the 4th largest number of cases. Pakistan is number 15. Bangladesh is number 18. Right. So 3 of the South Asian nations are in the top 20 of the world, and it doesn't look like we are going to be close to flattening the curve in the foreseeable future. We're thinking about July. Is one date when maybe we will hit the peak. So what's happening in India certainly is we are now beginning to unlock as the numbers are rising, right? And it's up to really the state governments to deal with this situation and how do they go about doing it. They are hampered in this partly because of the fiscal federalism structure in India, which was again always leaning towards the center. And as I mentioned, that's the legal status. It's very much a pro-center federal model in India. But because of the way politics played out and the coalition politics, de facto the state governments had a lot of power prior to 2014. Another important aspect that I should mention in the context of India, it's really center, state, and local relations, because since 1993, we've also had a formal constitutionalized, decentralized model of local government, both in the urban areas and in the rural areas. But that again hasn't worked very well, partly because they are not backed by financial and administrative powers. There's a formal decentralization at the constitutional level and at the statutory level, but that hasn't permeated into a culture of that, of true decentralized governance. I've got about a minute left, and I'll wrap up by talking about the Kerala model. And that has been hailed internationally, but it's very interesting, and I'll just end with what accounts for the Kerala model's success, and maybe that's a way for us to focus on the positive stories, right, as we look at what's sort of happening. So in Kerala, I'm relying on a article written in the Economic and Political Weekly, which is one of India's leading academic vehicles, by the health minister and the health secretary of Kerala. And they identify really 3 broad points that account for the Kerala model. One, and again, this is important. This is when you respond to it, countries which have had long traditions of doing things in a certain way are the ones which are doing better. So to go back to Dian's point about coordination, maybe what we will take from this is we need to think about these things over the medium to long term for it to have effect. Right? The great leadership will not instantly be able to respond to a pandemic. So Kerala has had a very long investment in the health sector, they have a strong social foundation where there's an openness to civil society intervention. The Kerala government has been very transparent, and because of its track record in public investment in the social sector, Kerala is also backed, has one of the best decentralized models in terms of also giving financial allocation to the local authorities. So all those things have really worked, and this is not something that Kerala did most recently. One important fact which I'll mention, this perhaps accounts for the fact that states like Taiwan and Singapore have also done well, including Hong Kong, is a prior experience with dealing with an epidemic. Right? So SARS and MERS in the past. Kerala is one of the few states in India which in 2018 had a Nipah virus scare. And so they ended up training medical personnel and public health officials and public administration officials to gear up for a potential epidemic or a pandemic. And all that really has helped Kerala stand well against the pandemic. And it's one of the few states in India which has actually done very well. I'll stop here. I'm sure we'll have a rich discussion and I can elaborate on this. I'm sorry for being a little scattered, but I hope my points help build the case that all the others on the panel have made. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arun. We now turn to the Q&A session. We actually have a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to moderate this and pose them to you in the time that we have left. We can end a little later since we started a little later. So I'm going to start with a question from Danai Nachan from Thailand. This question is posed to Andrew Harding specifically, but there's also another question, a similar question by Mario Gomez from Sri Lanka, which is posed to all panelists. And the first question is that if the current situation is trending towards centralization of power, is it possible for this to be the new normal after the pandemic? And the more general question, related question posed by Mario to all the panelists is if anyone would like to speculate on how center-local relations may unravel in a post-crisis world where autonomy rights have been eroded, are regions and states likely to be able to recover these, especially in accessing resources, whether the courts are more likely to uphold autonomy rights in a post-crisis world. So that's the first question, first two questions to think about. I have one specifically for Cora here. Could you speak a bit on the responses taken by the provinces and municipalities in China to the spread of the human-to-human transmission of COVID-19? So if anyone would like to weigh in on the first question by Natanai and also Mario on center-local relations in the post-COVID situation.
Yes, I think this is a very serious danger. Cora has already drawn attention to the way in which China is using this situation to underline the need for a new security law, which of course will continue in operation long after the pandemic is over. So I think these questions are very important and very well conceived questions. I would hope that the experience of the pandemic has also underlined the need to maintain local autonomy, because people can see the way in which their subnational units have responded, and also underline the need for coordination between the center and the subnational units. So my hope would be the opposite of the implication of the questions, but I rather fear that you may in fact find a greater degree of centralization as people tend to emphasize the risks that are involved in these situations and the need to have a strong central government. But I think the real story is, as I think all the four speakers have underlined, is actually the need to maintain decentralization and a balanced form of central-local relations, rather than a sort of collapsing into the center. So one hopes that that is the message that would be taken away.
I just want to echo what Andrew said. I think I mentioned earlier, certainly in South Asia, what this crisis has led us to see is there's a real need for welfare, right? So India's had its migrant worker crisis. We've had a real difficulty in redistributing resources, not just at the state level, but also providing food, getting ventilators across to hospitals which need them. So I think so far the way it's worked, certainly in India, is these big central welfare measures, some of which have been effective, but many of the things that the Modi government did, for instance, when you look at the health crisis that the country is facing, and we're talking about the biggest metros with the best hospitals, have a great dearth of PPEs and ventilators. I think it's beginning to be clear, and people who study welfare rights and look at successful welfare models have been telling us for a while that decentralization is absolutely key for that. So the Modi government's big healthcare program, Ayushman Bharat, was trying to provide insurance, right, across the nation. And you realize you don't need insurance, you need physical hospitals and wellness centers for that. So that can only be done by allowing state governments and now local governments more power to decide what is required in particular areas. So I think I just endorse what Andrew just said. I'm optimistic. I don't think, I'll just say there are questions about whether we will all go to a wave of centralization. Just looking at the India example, the first impulse of the Modi government was to clamp down and use central measures. But they've also realized, and they're facing political flack, that the ineffectiveness of the measures means now they're delegating authority to the state governments, right? It's also, you have to, whether you're an authoritarian system or a democratic system, people will look at the actual playing out of policies and hold somebody to account. So perhaps that pragmatic impulse may actually lead to more thinking about decentralized measures. So I'm trying to be optimistic on that track.
Thank you, Arun. Cora?
So maybe I'll respond specifically to, was the question that you mentioned about what steps were taken by the local governments in order to stop the spread of the virus. I think well, in line with the central leadership's approach, strict control of movement of people, and also the mobilization of community watchdogs and organizations from the party, and also very strict law enforcement by the police as well as by the courts. So I think the party has been able to mobilize all its institutions and networks in the community to make sure that the virus won't spread. Although, as I said, and from what I heard, at least some anecdotally, I think some of the measures have been either the measures or the way of enforcing those measures have been pretty draconian. So I think, as I said, it's hard to assess the utility of the utility gained or lost in the fight against pandemic in mainland China, because first of all, we don't know what the cost to health truly is, and also we don't know the true extent of the costs to rights and liberties as a result of the measures taken.
Thank you, Cora. Andrew, Andrew and Arun, there are two related or interrelated questions for you. Andrew is very popular here today. The first, Andrew, is on the politics of center-local relations. So a question from GT Nagarjun from India. He says that in India, there's a multi-party system. It always results in conflict between the state and the central governments. So how should this situation be handled? And related to that is a question from Ranajai Sen for Arun. Do you see politics informing center-state relations with states governed by opposition parties being discriminated against or facing more pressure on how they are handling the pandemic? And I think these two questions also speak to the earlier question that Mario posed on how center-local relations might unravel in this post-COVID world. Andrew?
These are very interesting and very important questions. I think the world over, particularly parties in opposition, have been challenged in terms of how to respond, because obviously they want to make some capital to hold the government to account, but at the same time, they don't want to be appearing to damage the national interest. And so there's also a sense that everybody together in this situation. So it's a very fine kind of line that they have to draw when they're trying to hold the government accountable. I can't comment on India in particular. I will leave that to Arun, who knows obviously a lot more about it, but I'm put in mind of Amartya Sen's book called The Argumentative Indian. I don't know whether Indian politicians are more argumentative than anybody else's politicians. But when you find that governments at any level are defective in their decision making, there has to be an opportunity for opposition. But at the same time, you don't want to go beyond the line of holding the government to account in terms of actually confusing messaging and so on. So I think opposition parties have to be fairly careful in how they approach this.
Thanks for the questions, and I agree with Andrew that they're really interesting questions. Again, we're talking about authoritarian models and democratic models, and it's not clear that the response to COVID shows us that any one system has been better. Right? I think there's a way in which an authoritarian system can also be very responsive to the local situation, and Cora's analysis suggests China is not such an example. But there have been other places where that might work, right? And even democratic models, I think we realize that just these categories don't help us look at what leads to a successful response. I would suggest that things, expertise, public trust in government, these are very important. I think Germany's response, partly why it has done so well, is it very early, and maybe Angela Merkel's own background as a research scientist helped her make that decision to go very quickly to the scientific response. And I think that has, across the world, when we look at successful examples of Taiwan, Vietnam, where there's been a very close collaboration between people of the scientific community, and also how the public responds to the government's plea that you stay in lockdown and really sacrifice during this time. So I just wanted to throw those factors also into the mix. On the opposition parties, so the interesting thing is Kerala, of course, is not ruled by a BJP government. And we saw some tensions initially when the Kerala government wanted to allow for a more loosening of restrictions, which they felt were unscientific and unnecessary, but the central government pushed back against that. So I think there was a little of that, and as Ranajai follows political developments in India much more closely, and he knows that in the last week, the opposition ruled states of Maharashtra and Delhi, there was some fear of a takeover. This is what Andrew talked about, the idea that in an emergency, you declare an emergency and completely take over local relations. But again, it's perhaps the nature of the pandemic and the fact that we are actually doing worse as we are going along, that the central government has to now think, if we take over and we don't do a good job, then we are going to have to face the flak. Right? And that possibly is the reason why the Modi government is not so eager right now to take over governments of opposition parties. We know that in the pandemic, this politics was playing out. It's unfortunate that one reason for things not being worked at the central level is probably because the Modi government was trying to manage politics in the state of Madhya Pradesh and take over that government, which it eventually did. But that led to a delay in focusing on pandemics. So in constitutional democracies, I wouldn't rubbish politics. I think politics is important as a way to keeping a check on governments. Some people might think, why are you focusing so much time on politics? You should just focus on the pandemic. I think that's a mistake. I think there's a way in which talking about politics and representation also is a way to ask for accountability. So I think it is a factor that plays. Whether a state is ruled by the same party as the ruling government or not is a factor, but I don't think it's a conclusive factor. So to give you an example, I live in Bangalore in Karnataka, which is right now a BJP state. But the BJP chief minister, he has been very vocal in asking for more revenues, right? So the fact that he's from the same party as the ruling party at the center is not stopping him from being fairly vocal in saying, you must release funds for us to be able to fight the pandemic. So I'd say they're relevant factors, but they're not necessarily destructive factors.
There's actually a question that's open to all panelists, and I want to post this to everyone for brief responses. And the question is, counter-pandemic legislation in a lot of Asian states typically stipulate different roles for the central government and local governments during a pandemic. So the question is, how would a legal system operate during these times of urgency in managing a pandemic to ensure that the statutory allocation of powers are adhered to? I think this was also addressed in some parts of Cora's presentation and mine.
And actually, I think what I'm about to say will address one specific question that's also addressed to me in the chat box on whether do I think that judicial review of some of the measures taken in the pandemic would be successful. So I think the role of courts in times of pandemic, like what's happening right now, and we're seeing a wave of legal challenges around the world against measures taken in times of COVID, like taken by airlines, for example, against quarantine measures. And what's happening right now reminds me of the role and performance of courts in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. So the fact that courts are embroiled in disputes that are raised in times of emergencies. So I think one factor that and from the from the 9/11 experience, we know that when we're in the heat of the emergency, so I imagine when the virus is still situation is still very strong, when the curve has still not been flattened in a particular jurisdiction, courts would probably be quite deferential to what government authorities say. So for example, if the state claims that they need to centralize powers, so we were going to interpret this statute in a particular way such that local governments will have fewer powers because we need plenary powers at the center in order to deal with the pandemic, even if they can't give any scientific proof of why that's the case. I imagine that in the heat of the pandemic, in the heat of emergency, courts might probably just accept that view and take it for granted without probing further. But after, from the 9/11 experience at least, after the emergency is over, and for 9/11, the emergency wasn't over until quite some years after, when courts are beginning to see new information about new information, like new investigations into, like new information came to light that shows that the executive might not be as reliable as it claims when it comes to intelligence information. The courts have started to be more activist. But I imagine that in this situation, the emergency would be over when the pandemic is somehow under control. And I imagine that if that's the case, courts might be more willing to look at evidence and really assess is it necessary that we keep these restrictions on the freedom of expression, or is it really necessary that the center holds on to these provisional emergency powers and so on? And that happens even in terms of like deferring to a state's statutory interpretation, for example. So I think the degree of deference is likely to reduce as the pandemic becomes more under control. But when for a particular jurisdiction, when the situation is still very serious, when the virus, the curve is still not flattened, I think courts will tend to be deferential to governmental authorities, and in particular the party, whether it be the state, well, probably the central level that claims that it needs more powers for dealing with the pandemic, or at a local level claims that we need to suppress freedoms in order to control the pandemic.
Thank you, Cora. And since we're talking about courts, this issue about courts has been raised in several questions that we have in our chat box. I'm going to respond to one question from David Tan on federal-state relations and whether a party can apply to court for a declaration that a particular state is in breach of a federal order and compel the state to comply with the federal order. Now, legal opinion is divided on this issue. The one view is that states are well within their authority to implement their own policies in managing public health matters and preventing infectious diseases. And this is provided for in the concurrent list of the federal constitution. And in addition to that, there is also the Local Government Act in Malaysia that provides local governments with significant powers to regulate these issues. The other opinion, of course, is that despite the concurrent jurisdiction, federal laws and regulations would prevail over state regulations. Now, for me, the real question here is whether state governments are in fact going against or defying the orders from the federal government, or if this is just a case of the state governments modifying or adding on to the orders that are provided by the federal government. So if the state governments wishes to impose certain or additional restrictions on matters which the federal government has not covered, then for me that doesn't really impede or prejudice the federal government's powers. In that case, I would probably think that the order will be in favor of the state government. But if the opinion that federal law prevails, federal law and order prevails, whatever the circumstances are, and considering the context of Malaysia as a very highly centralized federal system, then one might also say that it is possible for the affected party to sue the state government to apply for a declaration. But personally, my opinion is the former rather than the latter. There is a question from Trisha Yo from Malaysia. Hi, Trisha. Trisha is an old friend. Her question is for Andrew and Arun on differences between federal and unitary systems in COVID-19 management. So the question is whether there are significant differences in the way central-local relations have played out over the COVID-19 management in federal systems as opposed to unitary systems. Andrew?
Hi to Tricia, very nice to see you here. I'm a great admirer of your work on central-local relations in Malaysia, and you've raised a very interesting question. I would want to slightly push back on the assumption that we can easily distinguish for these purposes between federal and unitary systems, because I think theorizing about federalism these days tends to paint rather a spectrum of different positions rather than a clear distinction between federal and unitary states. As we've heard, some federal states like Malaysia can be very centralized. On the other hand, some unitary states like the United Kingdom can be extremely decentralized, at least with regard to the devolved assemblies. and so on. This is not something that I particularly thought about, or certainly haven't researched on, but my kind of gut reaction reading what I have read is that there's strikingly little difference in practice between the responses of federal systems and unitary systems, with the possible exception of the United States. But you know, the US has been exceptional in almost every way in terms of this discussion, so no great surprise there. And just harking back to the previous question, it's been striking to me, you know, how little use has been made of litigation in terms of enforcing federal laws at the state level, and so on. In terms of central-local relations, litigation has not particularly featured, although it has, as Cora points out, has featured in many other aspects of the pandemic. So the answer seems to be that really at the end of the day, you come down to some sort of version of cooperative federalism, or cooperative Unitarianism, if you prefer that way of looking at it. And of course, given the time frame of what's involved, it's a bit difficult to use litigation in this way. But I also notice there's been quite a lot of threatening of litigation, but not very much actual litigation between the federal or national units and the subnational units. But maybe some of this will come to light, you know, as the next few weeks and months unfold. So the answer basically to your question is, I think, no, I haven't really noticed very much difference between these two systems.
I want to say, I think I agree with Andrew. I don't, so as we discuss center-local relations and federal issues, I think this is an important subject, but I don't think it will be determinative of the overall response and its efficacy. So I think I can think of unitary states which have done very well in response to COVID-19. You look at the enactment of special laws. In Asia, one thinks of Taiwan and Singapore, which have done that. They've been quite responsive, but I don't think that's a function of there being unitary or federal states. It's a function of other things like political leadership, the ability to coordinate responses. Similarly, I'd say Germany's response has been very good. You could argue that Germany's federal structure also allows for that to happen, but it's also the quality of leadership that Angela Merkel has put forth. And I think one reason for the US's response is not, I mean, if you're looking at what is wrong with the US's response, I don't think we will come down to its federal model alone. It's probably the quality of leadership that you're getting from the White House. So I would say there are a range of factors. I think these institutional features of central-local relations can be helpful in channeling it. If you think carefully about how do you disperse funds and how do you empower state governments, local governments, that would seem to be a way to go about doing it. But that's no guarantee that in this time of populism and authoritarianism, and certainly in South Asia, we have a lot of populist and authoritarian rulers. It's not clear that, you know, just having design questions will remedy those problems. And just to remind us of the South Asian context, just as Cora was saying, so Martin Lee is arrested in the middle of a pandemic. There have been similar invocations of emergency powers, not so much for declaring formal emergencies, but we are beginning to see a rise of preventive detention laws to arrest 19-year-old women and 27-year-old women who are pregnant, and they are being detained because of pre-existing issues that came before COVID-19. Right? So in every polity, I think we should expect to see that it's not as if COVID-19 will mean that all else is forgotten and you can start from a blank slate. Those existing problems in the polity will continue to seep into responses to COVID-19. And I think the better, the more mature responses have tried to get past that and say this is a special situation. We need to deal with this. That's what you would expect from sagacious leadership in a crisis. Unfortunately, we've not seen enough of that. Very often, old political scores are being settled, even in the middle of a pandemic. which is quite disturbing. That's certainly the trend in Sri Lanka. The Gotabaya regime has done that. We see that in India and in other places as well. So I'll end with that. Thanks, Dian.
Thank you, Arun. Actually, in your final minutes of explanation, you've covered a lingering question that's there in the chat box about whether COVID-19 is an excuse or has been used as an excuse. And this has been addressed by Cora as well, and in parts of my presentation, to suppress not just fundamental freedoms, but also local government autonomy. And you've summarized it there very well, Arun. This is all the time that we have, unfortunately, unless you don't